Welcome to the Ontario Trillium Foundation's Collective Impact Granting Stream webinar on the preconditions of collective impact with Rachel Gaynor and Adam Vossi. Thank you so much for joining us today. Rachel Gaynor brings private sector know-how to Tamarack and is our newest Director of Engagement, where she combines emerging technologies, generative learning, and a results-driven approach to deepening engagement for Tamarack's nearly 20,000 learners. From 2008 to 2015, she championed the voice of the consumer of the customer at BlackBerry, where she developed a community analyst and project managers in the creation and delivery of a strategic, collaborative approach to understanding the needs of the community. Use qualitative and quantitative data analysis to influence stakeholders to affect change, and measure impact through client-centric key performance indicators. Adam Vossi received a Bachelor of Law and Master of Social Work from the University of Windsor and a Master of Law from Osgoode University at York University. He has been the Director of Pathway to Potential, the local anti-poverty strategy, since 2009. In 2013, he was appointed to the Provincial Minimum Wage Advisory Panel and also received the Distinguished Social Worker of the Year award through the Ontario Association of Social Workers Southwestern Branch. In 2014, Adam was awarded the Law Foundation of Ontario's Community Leadership in Justice Fellowship. In 2015, Adam received the Odyssey Award through the University of Windsor's Alumni Association. He is currently the President of the Ontario Association of Social Workers Southwestern Branch. I'll now pass things over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Great to have Adam here. We've had some preliminary great conversations, so we will dive into those very soon. Before we do get started, though, I just wanted to give you a quick webinar overview in terms of what some of our goals are for today's session. And then I'll let you know what you can expect from the session overall as well in terms of content. So we will review the preconditions of collective impact today. There are 3 of them, and discuss how they can impact your collective impact efforts. And in particular, if you're in an early phase of thinking about whether or not you want to journey into collective impact, this is the perfect session for you. The preconditions are really where you want to spend some time before you dive in, and if you're already in an initiative that you're considering as collective impact, this is a great session for you to sort of stop and take stock of where you're at, see where you need to maybe readjust and rethink some of your approaches and the folks that you're working with and your resources to ensure your initiative is resilient to move forward. So it's sort of a good session on both sides. And then in our discussion between Adam and myself, you'll discover some tools and some ideas and techniques that will help your collective impact efforts navigate these preconditions of the approach. So that's sort of the overall of where we'll go with, and you can expect to go with this webinar today. Those are the goals. But before we do get started, for those of you who have not been part of the 101 sessions before, we will take you through just a really brief overview of that. We will share with you what the preconditions are and dive into those, but where the real meat in it will be a discussion that Adam and I will have. I don't want to give anything away because he's got a great story to tell and some great features of the work that they've been doing. But we'll dive into that soon, but really you'll get some of the meat in the experience, and we'll have an opportunity, as Stephanie mentioned, to do some Q&A. So let's get started. So what is collective impact? It's a disciplined, multi-sector, collaborative approach to addressing complex social and/or environmental issues at a large scale. There are 5 conditions which will be shared with you in our next webinar, and then the 3 preconditions that we will be speaking to today. So those sort of 8 pre and during conditions of collective impact are where things really started with John Canyon and Mark Kramer. They're both social impact consultants at FSG, and they co-authored an article in Stanford Social Innovation Review back in 2011, which really brought collective impact to the forefront in terms of this framework. So in terms of this definition, for those of you that it's new to, it's really about the commitment of a group of multi-sectoral folks to a common agenda that are looking to move the needle on a larger scale social problem. So less about an individual program and more about a large scale agenda with multiple people at the table, which we will get into. We'll have a good conversation about who's at the table. What collective impact is not? It's not collaboration as usual. Collaboration as usual is a great approach to solving issues and working together, but collective impact disrupts the way we normally think about collaboration. It brings different people to the table. It changes your agenda from a focus on individual programs and single focus solutions. It brings different people to the table, and it's focused on longer term. So it's not about those short-term impacts that you're looking to achieve. So again, it's a disruptive way of thinking, and if you haven't had the 101 session, we have the recording, and I highly recommend going back to it. It's a great overview. But today we're going to focus in on the preconditions. There are 3 of them, as I mentioned: influential champions, urgency of issue, and adequate resources. These are the areas that we're going to dive into today, and that we highly recommend from the experience that we've seen with collective impact initiatives, where people should spend a good chunk of their time before making the commitment. The 5 conditions of collective impact, which I mentioned, will also be available in another webinar as part of this series. But there are the 5 of them, the first one being the common agenda. So all participants have a vision for change, including a common understanding of what the problem is. So there's an agreement as well on the approach to undertaking the agenda. So the common agenda comes together with multiple sectors at the table, and it's not a particular initiative that you're trying to accomplish. You may achieve your program or organizational goals in the process of working the common agenda, but it's really about the common agenda and working together to achieve it. That's the first condition. The second one is around shared measurement. We will get into this a little bit more today in our discussions about the preconditions, but shared measurement, this condition really distinguishes collective impact from other collaborative approaches. It speaks to using data to both define the initial problem and also to track the group's progress over time. This shared measurement assumes that the collaborative has an agreed upon method for collecting and making sense of the data as well. So it's not just about the data, but the processes within which you go about to collect the data. The third condition is about mutually reinforcing activities. The early impact of collective impact efforts is often achieved when a diversity of players learn how to better link up and align their various programs and services. So the activities do not need to be the same to work towards that common agenda and to measure its success, but they need to be mutually reinforcing and link up in a way that's progressive. The fourth, a very important element and condition of collective impact is continuous communication. This includes a shared understanding amongst partners regarding how they will conduct themselves with each other, as well as considering how the collaborative keeps their respective organizations and the public informed of progress and the learning along the way. It's a huge asset to have trust in a collective impact initiative, and what we like to say at Tamarack that we've adopted from our learning is that trust grows when you have continuous communication, and your collaborative will and your collective impact initiative will only grow at that speed so long as there's trust. So that continuous communication is a very important facet of a successful collective impact initiative. And finally, the fifth condition, which again we're just reviewing these at a high level today for the purposes of this webinar, but the fifth is backbone support, or another way we consider this is backbone infrastructure. Because collective impact requires a diversity of sectors and perspectives to work together, it's an intentional effort and investment. You need to make sure that the work of various partners is well coordinated. So a backbone infrastructure is a shared responsibility. It could be anything from a program manager and project manager to financial support to resources designed to gather data and determine those shared measurements. So the backbone support in your collective impact initiative does not make all the decisions. It's exactly that. It's there to be supportive. So it's a great facet, and there's lots of great discussions that can evolve around backbone infrastructure that I know have evolved from some of our previous sessions. So that'll be another great one to listen in on. But as promised, let's dive into the preconditions for collective impact. So less has been written about the preconditions than the 5 conditions that I just went over briefly. But really, in our experience, as I mentioned, this is where you want to spend some time, because collective impact, a collective impact model is something that takes time. You know, you're in this initiative for at least 3 to 5 years. It's a long-term, forward-looking approach to community change and making an impact that does take some time. So you want to make sure that you do due diligence in the early stages to make sure that you've set up the correct infrastructure and you've done the work to plan through. We know that things will change and there's always going to be iterative experiences and planning and progress, but the individual thinking around each of these areas has proven to help achieve success. Together, these preconditions remind us there's often significant groundwork at the outset of collective impact, and not to be scared away from it, but just to know that there's some guiding principles and ideas around there, which we'll dive into. And not without challenge, of course, but we have Adam here to share his experiences as well. It's an effort to confirm your partners and to reach an agreement on shared approaches. So in reviewing these 3 preconditions, I want to emphasize the following. So influential champions. These are folks who care deeply about the issue and are willing to become actively involved in championing your collective impact effort. They could be involved already, but not necessarily. Sometimes you need to reach outside of your existing networks, and we'll explore that more today, to ensure you have people at the table with you, the right people, the right organizations that have the power to have an influence and to champion your initiative forward along with you. And as you learn more about the different phases of collective impact, you may find that you need to revisit this precondition because your influential champions may change as you move along the phases. What we'll learn today is about where Adam is in his particular collective impact initiative and the influential champions that they've been engaging with thus far and how that's been evolving. The second precondition, urgency of issue. This is about doing a reality check regarding your shared issue. Is it on the radar of the general public? And how do you know that? If you discover that your issue is not perceived as urgent by the public, that may suggest that your group needs to do some work to raise awareness to build a profile of your issue to the public, or it may be that this issue is more appropriate for a program or organizational level and it's not necessarily in need of a collective impact model. So again, we will dive into this a little bit deeper, but in terms of urgency of issue, you really want to ensure that it's something that's a larger scale shared vision that needs a needle change on. And then thirdly, last but definitely not least, is adequate resource. We do have a couple of our colleagues here from the OTF, Ontario Trillium Foundation, to let you know where you can find out more about their funding streams at the end of this webinar. And so we do know that adequate resources is often about funding dollars, but it is also important to recognize that resources include other important contributions, such as time, meeting space, in-kind resources, and data. So those are the 3 preconditions that we will dive into today. Some questions to consider with your influential champions are, who are some recognized leaders in your community? Who will be important to influence policy and systems change around the issues that you're considering? And how connected are you to these individuals already? Also think about what you're asking them to do. And we're going to get into this a little bit more because that ask can be tricky, especially if you're asking for too much commitment up front. So think about what you want your influential champions to do and how would it be mutually beneficial if they were to be involved. And would you also be able to include their sphere of influence? So who else from their networks or from their organization could you include? And the relationships can build on one another. So those are some questions to consider with influential champions. We've learned some lessons from the engagement cycle and from fundraising. There is no one way to perfectly set the stage for dialogue with your influential champion. Sorry. So we have taken some learnings from fundraising that we'd like to share with you today. Firstly, what your existing relationship is with your influential champion or your potential partner has a lot to do with how you will engage with them. So take stock or take consideration of how you already know them or how you already, you may not know them and what your interactions might have been like in the past. And consider, have they been positive? Have they been negative? Do you know them through someone else? Make sure you are considering that experience and using that as you first reach out. So take stock of your own interactions with them thus far, or lack thereof. And secondly, know your audience. And so this is, I have a background in communications and writing and journalism, and this is a huge piece, not just for fundraising and for engagement, but just in general when you're engaging with anyone. So do your research without making assumptions. Learn about your partner in advance of reaching out to them to engage, to kick off the engagement. And what I mean by doing your research without making assumptions is to err on the side of inquiry. And Adam's got a great example that we'll dive into of how they've set the stage for engaging with new potential partners, especially ones that are outside of their networks. But again, when I say research without making assumptions, err on that side of inquiry. Ask questions, be interested in what they have to say rather than stating claims and passing judgment about the work. You want to be knowledgeable, but you also want to keep a two-way dialogue open about what they do and what could be beneficial for them as well. So as I mentioned, we're going to speak with Adam in a moment about he set the stage for dialogue when reaching out to their influential champions. And you'll see that they took a great, unassuming position that opened up the stage for two-way dialogue. What we like to consider as well are some of our lessons learned from fundraising, in particular use of this engagement cycle, which you will see on your screen if you're engaged with us online right now. When reaching out to influential champions, you want to be sure to think this through strategically, beginning with identification, informing, engagement, and stewardship. So first, and some of this you might we often take for granted, but having a bit of a model and a circular effect helps us is a helpful tool to help us make sure that we're not missing anything and we're being thoughtful and strategic in our approach. So first, identification. So identify, pick a partner and consider the benefits, preferably mutual benefits, of selecting this partner. Number two, inform. What are you ultimately asking of this partner? Are you asking of them now? Are you asking of it later? And consider that timing in that information. Three is engagement. What is the activity that you want them to engage in? And again, that could change over time depending on the phase of collective impact that you're involved in. Number four is actually to be engaged. How will you know when they're engaged? Think through in advance what those key indicators will be. Will it be a qualitative measurement, a quantitative measurement, gut feeling? Will it be, how will you know when your partners and influential champions are engaged, and how will you, and then most importantly as well there is number five is stewardship. How will you keep this partner engaged longer term? And sometimes, I know we've even run into experiences with this, is that we do the work to set the stage and engage people, but then we don't necessarily think through how we make this a long-term commitment. So I want to welcome Adam. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so pleased to have you. So before we dive deeper into your experience with influential champions and that call to action, could you tell us a little bit more about Pathway to Potential and the role you play there?
Sure. Pathway to Potential was launched back in 2008 by the City of Windsor and the County of Essex in partnership with the United Way, the School of Social Work at the University of Windsor, and one of our legal clinics. And it was launched around the same time the province was launching their first five-year poverty reduction strategy. So at that point, I think there was a recognition in the Windsor-Essex community that the activities we had been undertaking to date on poverty weren't necessarily working, and I think the feeling was that the provincial strategy was an opportunity to take a real stab at this new multi-sector approach at poverty reduction, and it was really, Pathway to Potential was really modeled after the work that had been done with the vibrant communities. And so I was hired on in early 2009. At the time it was just myself, and a couple of years in we were able to hire another staff. So my role now is director, but we're certainly a large network, a large multi-sector collaborative network with a mandate to reduce and prevent poverty in Windsor-Essex.
Great. So where are you in your collective impact initiative right now? Are you early on, and sort of what brought you to collective impact?
Sure. Well, I would say right now we're at the phase 2 initiating action phase, although you do sort of feel like you kind of go, these phases feel somewhat fluid, because when I look back at my 7 years with Pathway to Potential, in a lot of ways, all of those years were really, doing a lot of these different things. Assessing the readiness of the community, I think, was really important. And I think in some of those years, we did take a stab at many actions that I think were really trying to engage champions, but influential champions. But I think overall, if I look at sort of the evolution of Pathway to Potential, I think what we found is that we sort of made a splash in the community when we launched, and we tried to set up a big sort of infrastructure or structure, I would say, with a round table and several working groups. But I think, to your points about, what is your ask? I think at that time, because we were so early on in the work, we didn't really have that nailed down. We weren't able to tell business leaders in the community exactly what they were coming to these monthly meetings for. So I think we've really done a lot of assessment in the community, and we've put a lot of emphasis on creating the urgency in the community and figuring out ways to communicate about poverty so that there is a greater sense of urgency, because I think that's been something that we've recognized, that poverty remains fairly hidden in the community in a lot of ways, despite our best efforts.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about who you've had at the table before, and so core to making some of your progress has been bringing the right people to your table. So in this collective impact model, it's your influential champions. Let's talk about this a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about who you were talking with already in your network? And it doesn't necessarily need to be the particular organizations, but the type of organizations, and how is that going? And then how did you move beyond your existing network?
Sure. I think for most of those 7 years, a lot of the most invested and engaged partners in our network, which is quite broad. I mean, we have dozens and dozens of organizations and people who are very committed to poverty reduction, but I think for the most part, we're talking a lot about the social sector, the not-for-profit sector, some broader public sector. We are funded by the municipality, by the city and the county, so we definitely have elected officials who are invested in our work, so that's a huge benefit. But overall, I think one of our big gaps that we had been identifying was the fact that we weren't necessarily engaging really influential business leaders in our work on a consistent basis. So that was partly the genesis for this new collective impact model that we're embarking on now, which was really a question about how can we better align poverty reduction goals and economic development goals in our community, because what we had been finding is that, you know, in our circles, Pathway to Potential's network, we're talking a lot about poverty issues. People sort of understand the barriers and they understand the distinctions between generational poverty and working poverty and many of these things, but then our network was starting to notice, and our leadership team was starting to notice, that there's this parallel conversation in the community about economic development that seemed completely disconnected from poverty. And so that was a big revelation for us, and I think that was really one of the motivators, is that how do we start to make these connections and recognize that that collective prosperity and poverty reduction are, you know, they're two sides of the same coin, that we can't really have a conversation about economic development without acknowledging poverty and really understanding the poverty context in our community. So that got us starting to talk to people who we wouldn't really talk to, who were our unusual suspects, and through our first round of consultations back in March, and I should say, just by way of context, that we got, through the OTF, we got seed funding to embark on this collective impact exploration. So we applied for seed funding to really investigate that question: can we better align poverty reduction goals and economic development goals through collective impact? So back in March, we met with our Economic Development Corporation, with the Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors, with academic institutions, hospitals, you know, a lot of young entrepreneurs, young leaders in the community. So really tried to tap into a cross-section of folks that we don't necessarily talk to on a regular basis, to just find out, what do you even think about poverty? I mean, is this on your radar? Do you think that this lack of alignment is even an issue? So we really didn't approach it we didn't want to approach it having, you know, these solid answers, or we wanted to kind of leave it very open-ended to see what people, to kind of get the temperature of the community and see where people are at.
Right. And that's the part that I think has been really key to some of your success in those early on stages, is that when you were opening up that dialogue, like you say, you're just asking for feedback. So before we jump into that, maybe, you know, one of the things that we get asked a lot, and I personally get asked a lot from the engagement side, is, so how do you reach out to these people who are outside of your network? So there are, you know, you can probably, there's a great top 100 exercise that we have on our website that can help you pull together a list of potential influential champions. But if they're not in your networks and they're sort of those unusual suspects, to use your great words there, you know, how do you get people's attention? How do you get your message across? Can you walk us through your experience trying to connect with these people?
Sure. I think a couple of factors were really important. I will say, you know, because I don't want to diminish some of the work that, and the groundwork essentially leading up to where we are now. We launched a living wage campaign last year, and we actually did that in partnership with the Chamber of Commerce. So that's a great example of how I think doing that and making that connection at that point probably really helped us be able to engage them in this further conversation about this bigger, you know, collective impact project. So I think it's important to recognize, you know, there are some ways to engage these partners in an incremental way, without sort of just blindsiding them with this big question that might seem out of context and out of nowhere. So I think for some of them there was the groundwork, there was a recognition that probably that we're doing some good work in the community. But I think probably more importantly, in our community, what's been happening, especially around economic development, I think many of the folks on the call will probably know that our region has been hard hit by, you know, economically, and we've had significant losses of our manufacturing jobs. And I think economic development has been such a hot button issue in the community. And so we really thought that for a lot of the folks who are in that world and very concerned about the economy, that this would be actually this top conversation about collective impact and connecting poverty reduction and unemployment and economic development would be very timely. And so we kind of looked at the political landscape as well and thought, you know, how can we actually maybe help out some of these other organizations in the community who are struggling with the same issues in a lot of cases? Because, for example, you know, our Economic Development Corporation, I know, has been asked by City Council to demonstrate the social return on investment for the funding that they get, and so we're talking about issues like shared measurement and things like that, but we're not necessarily having those conversations together. So I think in some ways by us approaching them, we open the door to a welcome conversation, but in some cases, to be honest, it hasn't been easy as well, because I think some of the folks that we've tried to approach, who we've seen as sort of the real influencers in the community, especially as far as, you know, their economic status, I think there's still a perception that poverty, when you mention poverty, that it's sort of, you know, that this issue of charity, or this issue that is the domain of not-for-profit organizations, and so if people don't see that there's some connection to the, you know, to economic development, how do you get them there? So it's still, I think we'll still be challenged with some folks, but we're starting with the ones we think we can make some headway with.
So you've gone through sort of your first round back in March, you said, right? Are you continuing to do further, like, is this an ongoing outreach that you're doing to engage more influential champions at different phases then?
It is, yeah. So we wanted to take the feedback. We talked about, and we're working with Paul Schmitz, who some of the folks on the line might also know, who has worked for the Obama administration, and he's done a lot of work around collective impact, and he's been helping us. So he and I did those first round of consultations together, and he's coming back actually next week, and we met with 45 people overall back in March, and we're going to have we're having an event on collective impact with over 100 people attending, and then we're going to have a couple of other smaller events and some more interviews with folks to share what we learned from the first conversations in March, and then to see, you know, what people think of that, if that sort of fits with their diagnosis of the problems and the challenges in the community, and then we'll keep building from there. So I think our approach is really looking, you know, doing this in stages and moving at a pace that makes sense for the community, not trying to do too much, not trying to rush it, but at the same time trying to keep some momentum going.
Right. Yeah, that momentum piece is huge. I do like as well and appreciate that the channels within which you're engaging with people are different. So, you know, it's email, it's phone call, but it's also event style and it's outreach style. So there's variety in there that's appropriate for the volume of people and then the type of partner that you want to engage with. So that's great. Why don't we move now to urgency of issue? Because you did mention that you guys did spend some time around building up this area. So just to share, so again, this urgency of issue is really about a reality check. So in Adam's experience, you guys are focused on this connection between poverty reduction and economic development. So there's, you know, we'll talk about this more, but there's sort of an innate understanding that there is urgency around those issues, particularly in your area. But others may not have enough data or information to understand or to prove that there is urgency around the issue. And so that may suggest that there needs to be some groundwork. And it sounds like you've done some groundwork really to raise awareness and build the profile of your issue in the public. So we'll explore that a little bit more. Some of the things I'd like to explore around just generally this precondition are, one, The need to uncover data about current conditions surrounding the issue. You know, in the beginning of this webinar, I talked about how shared measurement is a key condition to collective impact, and that gathering and using this data both quantitatively and qualitatively is important during the preconditions phase. So using data to make the case around the urgency of the issue. What is that number, or what is that piece of data that's confirming, or the collection of data that's actually proving there's urgency around this issue that warrants a collective impact commitment. Number 2 is mapping, the mapping of existing community resources. So in this early phase, considering who is already involved and at the table, and what or who are the resources strengths that are already at play. So consider your asset-based, take an asset-based approach, if you will, but also consider where are there some gaps. So doing the rigor to consider that, and we'll talk about resources, adequate resources in a moment as well. And then third is building a narrative about the issue. So what is the existing narrative about the issue in your community? Who has informed that narrative? What is missing from the narrative? And who needs to hear this story in order to champion needle change impact? So let's explore your experience around urgency of issue, Adam. Can you, first of all, so how have you, or have you chosen to define your issue at Pathways? And what was some of the data, or what did you use to make the case?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we've been compiling a lot of data on the needs around poverty in the community, and that's been a big part of the work, building that awareness, creating the urgency. But I think in terms of this current project we're working on, what we've done is we've really tried to compile a lot of the reports in the community over the last 5 years and put it in a fairly easy to digest format for the stakeholders that we're going to be meeting with. And that just demonstrates how much research has already been done in the community and how much alignment there is actually across some of these domains that we've often thought of as being very isolated or fragmented. So I think there's an assumption that, well, we have folks writing reports on poverty over in some segments of the community, and then, the chamber might put out a paper on some economic issue. But I think what we found through compiling some of these resources is that you were really talking about a lot of the same issues consistently in the community. And that actually has come through our consultations as well, is that there's a lot of common narratives coming up about, the skills gap in the community, and there's a lot of talk about, the need for training, and there's a lot of talk about barriers and how barriers like transportation have, they have a huge impact obviously on folks who, are struggling with poverty, but also they have an impact on employers. So I think that's part of our strategy is, we're not necessarily, we know going to convince everybody to care about poverty just because we can demonstrate that the needs are high in the community. But I think if we make some of those links between the poverty situation in our community and how that affects the economy, I think that's where we're seeing we might have some more traction. That's our guess anyway, and our hope, and it remains to be seen. But I think so far that's been borne out by some of our initial conversations.
Okay. You talked about synthesis, like the wealth of data that's been out there and reporting, and synthesis of this data. And so for some, that just the word alone, data or shared measurement, can feel daunting. Can you just tell us briefly about what this looks like for you guys at Pathways? How are you synthesizing the data? Is it resources that you have on site, or do you have any advice for those people that don't have the kind of skill set and resources to take a hold of such wealth of information out there? Because it can be daunting.
Yeah, it definitely can be daunting, and we don't necessarily have a lot of in-house capacity here with full-time staff to be doing a lot of data analysis and things like that, but we have put together reports of our own, both primary and secondary research over the last few years. But really what we did for this collective impact work we're doing now is just take the last 5 years, look at all the reports in the community that essentially have touched on some of the issues, whether, you know, it's food security or transportation, economic development, education. We've just kind of highlighted, you know, what are some of the key findings? What are these reports saying? We've made it really easy, kind of color-coded it, but it was really just kind of going through them very thoroughly and making sure that we're covering all that community feedback that has been gathered and reporting it out. And I think part of our strategy there is saying, you know, we're not coming to you, to the folks we're trying to recruit and engage, saying we've just invented this new idea, you know, about how we should work differently or about these needs. We're just sort of reflecting back. This is what the community is going through. This is what's already been found. Now, how can we work differently to actually start moving the needle? Because I think that's ultimately what's been driving this project for us, is that as much as we might be, you know, having some success raising awareness about poverty, and even, you know, campaigns like Living Wage are great, but if we're not ultimately able to show that collectively we're moving the needle on poverty, that we're actually lifting people out of poverty, then in my view we're not, like, I'm not doing my job and I'm not fulfilling my mandate. So I think people will kind of understand that and respect that. And if you can show them data in an easy to digest format, I think then that makes that conversation easier as a starting point.
Okay. I think it's comforting to hear that, you know, you too, as much as you've been involved in the data synthesis and pulling that together, that it is overwhelming for those who are involved as well. It is an undertaking, but it's an important one around the urgency. So that's great. I just wanted to briefly share this matrix for people as a tool, and it will be available in the send out afterwards, but we've adapted this urgency and important matrix from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits. Many of you might have been part of a training course or read the book. But you know, in terms of thinking about this urgency of issue and actually executing on it, determining what steps to take first, second, third, and longer term is an important part of the progress. And as we've been talking about, and Adam's reiterated as well, is that often this is a phased approach and it's iterative based on your learnings, and that's really where, you know, where you're going to see success when you step out there, you take some action, you take inventory, and then you take another step. But definitely putting some rigor around assessing the importance and urgency of your actions can go a long way. So just, you know, take a look at some of the activities and some of the people and some of the stages that you need to be at, and map them against a matrix like this. What actions do you take? What actions can you delegate? And sometimes what I've found as well that can be most important is deciding what not to do, which you can see there in the bottom left-hand corner, where you'll see a section on avoid discard. It's about those distractions. So sometimes this may not be about actual actions, but it could be about what data, partners, or resources are you not going to pursue and why. So going back to those conditions of the 5 conditions that we briefly went over, where you have something like a common agenda that you're working towards. If you're working on that common agenda and that's defined and shared, so in your case, Adam, with poverty reduction and its relationship to economic development, what are you not approaching in terms of needle change for community change, and what does that look like? So just a thought on this, Adam. Can you walk us through a little bit some of the planning discussions that you've had at Pathway, maybe even in particular around the influential champions? Like, how did you decide who to engage, who not to engage, who's more urgent than others? Because it sounds like you had you had some funding to kick off that stage, and it was more of a defined phase of your collective impact model. So could you just share some of your thoughts about the urgency planning and the overall importance of that work?
Sure. I think a lot of our conversations have revolved around, well, who's essential to this process if we're going we're going to move the needle, if we're going to bring the attention to this issue. And I think one approach we've taken, we have done the sort of the top 100 exercise, and that's been really helpful. But I think even back in March when we had those initial conversations with some of our community leaders, we asked them, like, who needs to be part of this? Like, you know, if these people aren't part of these conversations, who else needs to be here? And a lot, that was really instructive for us to hear some of the names that came forward. And I think that also helps, because then it's not us just, you know, saying, well, we're going to cold call so-and-so, but it's more of a, you know, you've been identified as somebody who absolutely has to be part of this if it's going to be effective. So that, you know, can be helpful as far as recruitment goes. So we really wanted to ensure that we were getting the right fit, not, and that's part of the assessment too, is looking at, you know, some people, some names might be really prominent in the community, but how do you align, you know, are their interests aligned with what you're trying to do, and is it a good fit where that engagement can be sustained over the long term? So I think that's what we're really trying to drill down into right now, and focus more on that quality as opposed to the quantity of folks who are involved, and really make sure that the ones that do want to carry this torch forward are going to be invested for the long haul.
Okay. I love that there's that community engagement element to it as well, right? So who does your community think that you need to engage in order to have an influence? That's a great, there's a whole, you know, we can do another whole session on community engagement in this area of work as well. Being conscious of time, I want to move along to adequate resources. So we know that often resourcing can be heavily focused around funding in dollars. But it's important, as I said, to recognize that there's so many other resources that are important, that make important contributions to what we do here in Collective Impact. So human resources can be amongst the most important resource you have. Sometimes this doesn't need to come as a paid staff member, but could be volunteers, research assistants, or students and interns. Even services in kind, like websites and communications creations and management, are important, or perhaps fiscal agents for your backbone infrastructure. And also consider resources, financial resources, resourcing the activities needing to support your collective impact initiative. So an important element in the preconditions is to take stock and take inventory of who you have and what you need. And oftentimes it's about being creative in how you can finance and source the work, and the collective impact model brings an interesting approach to that. But definitely in the early stages, it's something that you want to think through. So can you remind us again, just so we have an idea in terms of the undertaking, can you remind us again, how many official people and staff do you have at Pathways, and are they all sort of directly or indirectly involved in the Collective Impact Initiative? And have you started to build a multi-sectoral team that's fully and wholly committed to the work that includes outside of Pathways?
Right now, including me, we have 2 full-time staff, and both are very involved in the Collective Impact project, but also we're both very involved in all kinds of other projects that we have. So right now we're a little bit stretched, there's no question about it, and we haven't started concretely sort of building that, looking at that broader team of staff yet, because we didn't want to get out ahead of the consultation process, because we didn't want to presume anything about our role. We want to make sure there might be some really good information or ideas that emerge about, you know, how we could really creatively as a community structure this, so that it doesn't, you know, it might be pulling from other organizations, but we haven't really landed on that definitively yet.
Definitely yet. So can you tell us a little about your experience involved in your resource and capacity now that you've gotten started? Has there been some plan? Is it a planning? Is it a sort of a very structured and planned approach, or is it an evolving and organic approach so far? What does that look like?
It seems blended, I think, between the two. I think right now we're certainly exploring and wanting this to evolve organically. We don't want to force this on the community, and we want to make sure that there's a need and that people see the value in it. But then I think as we're doing this work, we're definitely planning. I mean, we're always thinking about what would be the best way to engage people moving forward. What's the best way to introduce this information, these huge amounts of information, especially when we're talking about collective impact, and there's still a lot of fuzziness among a lot of folks about what exactly it is and isn't. So I think we're trying to figure out what the right way to approach it is in the community, and I think resources are key. I mean, I think just for people to even know, and we're talking about the fact that Ontario Trillium Foundation as a funder has made a commitment to this approach. I mean, that's significant when people understand that there's a significant funder that's driving this and invested in this approach. I think that kind of thing matters too. So it's important that people know that that's potentially a benefit down the road if we can pull this off as a community and make it work.
Right. Agreed. Thank you so much. So thank you so much, Adam, for speaking with us about the preconditions for collective impact. You're a great example in the work that you're doing there, and it's great to see how the work has been evolving.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. With that, I believe I'm going to open the floor back up to you, Steph, for a little bit of question and answer.
Yeah, we have one question that came in, which might be all that we have time for here. But Jeffrey Sinclair says, I'm working on a CI initiative that has mostly social services leaders and perspective. And a number of these leaders have struggled with other initiatives to engage the private sector. How do we leave space for the views of the private sector leaders to be valued?
Great question, private sector. We did see in some of the in-person workshops that we did across Ontario that often they're not necessarily at the table. Adam, do you have any experience engaging the private sector and how that went so far?
I think it's really important, that point you made, Rachel, about setting aside assumptions, I think, and really not making judgment, not rushing to judgment. I think it's so, we all have a tendency, I think, to do that at times, to assume that the private sector's interests are often sort of one-dimensional. And to be honest, a lot of my assumptions have been challenged throughout this process so far, because I realized that in some cases, folks that I thought maybe didn't necessarily care too much about poverty, who might be from the private sector, actually just didn't understand it fully and really wanted to be engaged and involved, but needed more data. And I think you have to, so I think it's important to try and do that assessment of what would make their involvement easier and what would facilitate their engagement in the process. And I think what I've noticed with a lot of our involvement with the private sector so far is that, I mean, they're very data driven. They want to know, what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about poverty, and then they're very solution oriented and they want to get stuff done. So I think recognizing that there are lots of opportunities. I think sometimes what can happen in these multi-sector approaches is that we're not, as the person asking the question kind of alluded to, we're not creating that enough space for true dialogue, and maybe we're alienating each other through the language we use. If it's too heavily focused on the social sector, we might start using jargon that might not mean as much to folks, or might, some people from the private sector might have trouble understanding. And but I think there's a lot of shared interest that can be uncovered through creating that space for conversation. But I think you also don't want to, back to your earlier point too, Rachel, you want to be really clear about what is your ask. So I think to this point, we've been really careful about not asking for a huge commitment from anybody. Really what we're trying to do is get a sense of where they're at, what is it that motivates them and they care about, and then at the appropriate time figuring out, okay, what level of involvement makes the most sense for this person. Because from my own experience, I've had, you know, when we first started up the roundtable at Pathway to Potential and we had invited lots of business leaders, they quickly stopped coming to meetings regularly because there wasn't enough of that concrete action for, you know, for where they were at and what they needed. So I think we always have to be conscious of that.
For sure. I especially like your comment about the language, and because as Stephanie mentioned in my bio at the beginning, I mean, I was in nonprofit prior to my previous role before coming to Tamarack. So I was at Tamarack, and I, you know, worked for 7 years in at BlackBerry in technology, a completely different industry. And certainly, you know, many people in that industry were not, you know, not to make a one-dimensional approach, but it's different worlds ultimately. And so what I like to think of that is what's your elevator pitch, right? And your elevator pitch, depending on who you're in the elevator with, is going to be very different for someone who's in your sector or that you work with on a day-to-day basis versus someone who's completely out of your sector and may not be speaking the same language. So taking some time to think through that elevator pitch is key to opening up the doors for communication, and like you say, to not make assumptions about what they, like, don't make assumptions that they know about your work, and don't make assumptions that they don't know. Take that approach of inquiry first, I think would go a long way. Back to you, Steph.
Yeah, so that's great. Thank you again so much, Rachel and Adam, for sharing your insights and perspectives with us on the call today. And many thanks to all of you for joining us. So Ontario Trillium has a new granting stream for collective impact. Doug Gore is joining us on the line today from Ontario Trillium Foundation. So I'm going to pass things over to Doug to tell us a little bit more about that granting stream.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thank you, Rachel and Adam. Adam, thanks for doing such a great job on really kind of bringing it to life and making it real for us. Given that we are actually out of time, I'm not going to spend very much time at all. I'm really here just to say that we do, in fact, have a collective impact stream that is somewhat new to us. There are kind of 3 stages of that stream, but I'm not going to go into the details of that right now. Stephanie, if I can get you to flip just to the last slide where our contact information is. What I would encourage you to do if you have questions is to follow up directly with us. We've got lots of information on our website pertaining to our approach to investing in collective impact and in fact being involved in collective impact. We've got the email address there that you can see for my colleague Naulo, who's here in the room with us, who is really the glue keeping our collective impact process and program moving forward. Or you can reach out to your local program manager and get them involved. Unlike our other streams where we kind of keep a bit of an arm's length distance from the individual projects, in this one, our program managers and our strategy leads here in Toronto get directly involved in the process. So I know we're short on time, but please do reach out to us if you think you are working on something that may be, or if you've just got questions and want to know more about our process, we'd be happy to answer those. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Doug. There are also many opportunities for future learning within Tamarack, multi-day events, one-day events, and webinars. So on this slide here, you'll see we have our big Community Change Institute happening in Toronto this September. If you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to myself. As for the webinars, upcoming webinars, we have Resilience and Money with Brian Jacema. That's on June 14th. Evaluations that work, specifically for nonprofit sector, which is on June 22nd. And then we have 5 phases of collective impact, Thursday, June 23rd. As for our one-day events, Tamarack will be hosting 3 upcoming one-day events for deepening community for collective impact and resilient communities. So June 14th in Toronto and June 23rd in London will be deepening community. And then June 20th in Aurelia, we'll have our Resilient Communities one-day workshop. So if anyone wants to know more information about these or wants to register, just feel free to visit the link at the bottom there, tamarackcommunity.ca/events. So as promised, in a few days we will email you with links and the audio and other materials related to today's call. We also welcome your feedback on these calls, so please do email Tamarack to let us know how we're doing. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Rachel and Adam, and have a great day.